Hello. Good morning, everyone. Environment Sustainability Committee meeting for today. Check attendance, and we have all members present, so there'll be no apologies. I'll call if there are any declarations of interest in matters on today's agenda. Very good. Then we'll move to the first item, which is the State Emergency Service Support Policy. Does any councillor wish for council officer to come forward to answer any questions? Yes.
We are still good morning, Mayor and Councillors. Matt Pinder, I'm the Emergency Management Sustainability Manager, and I'm responsible for SES.
Thank you, Mr. Pinder. Thank you for a great presentation. I actually learned a lot about the SES in reading that. And I was surprised at how much local government pay for. I thought it being a state emergency service, it was mainly funded by the state government, so that was a bit of an eye-opener. May I ask, in one of the attachments there, the MOU from October 2018 is listed as a confidential document. I've read through it. I didn't see anything that I thought was confidential. Are there some things that are sensitive that shouldn't be shared?
The main reason it was marked around confidential through this committee was in relation to not having engaged with Queensland Fire and Emergency Services as our partner, and just saying, hey, there is a potential for this to be made public. Do you have any commercial and confidence type concerns with that? That was the only consideration. Yeah. So we can take that on notice for future things when we do those engagements.
I might do a variation or something to look at. If we could publish it, I think people would find it interesting to read. Mr. Pitt, I noticed also in the report it talks about the August on page 7 of 97. In August 2013, a review of the police and community safety portfolio entitled Sustaining the Unsustainable report was received by the state government. The report, when referring to the frontline capacity of the SES, commented the overall issue of funding the service, particularly cost sharing arrangements between the state government and local governments, needed a lot of work. May I get your advice on how things are progressing in that field?
In 2018, the Local Government Association of Queensland, at the request of a council in North Queensland, made a motion or made a resolution to pursue a further review and clarification from the state government in relation to those funding relationships and the shared arrangements. A gentleman by the name of Cam Darby was appointed to conduct the review into the SES, and that has progressed. Various councils, SES volunteers and other emergency services have been interviewed in relation to that, including myself, and that report is currently sitting with the state government. At this time we've got no indication of when that may be released and what that may or may not include.
And I guess once I read this, Mr. Pinder, I asked some questions about funding, and from what I can see, what are we budgeting? I know it says in the report that the financial implications of this, there are no new financial implications for council. These costs are included in the operational budget. How much money is council spending on the vital work that SES do in this financial year?
So look, Ipswich City Council has long been recognised as supporting the SES and supporting the local community, and I think council should be commended for that. In approving that funding this year, it is estimated to cost council $407,000, and that figure includes the fleet equipment. It includes ongoing costs in terms of training and development, supplying food for SES volunteers responding, and a number of other things. Approval for that funding is achieved through the annual budget process. So our commitment to funding that level is established each year based on general business cases and required processes there. Council owning all the facilities that SES occupies undertakes capital investment and improvement. This financial year, Council is funding $102,000 to increase security and storage at the SES Thorn Street depot. Council is also constructing a new amenities building, which has been externally funded by in partnership with the state government at $510,000.
How much of that is council funding? How much is state of that 510?
That question I'd have to take on notice and get back to you, unless Mr. Dill, would you have anything off the top of your head?
15,000 is the grant that we received.
So Mr. Dill will say that 15,000 is the grant for the 510.
Yep. I might take that one on notice and reply formally if that's okay with you, Mayor, just to ensure we have the most accurate figure.
Yeah, I just think the ratepayers should know how much of their rates are being spent in this area.
Absolutely.
One more question.
No,
recommendation B talks about continue to advocate for legislative review. As a summary, what kind of legislative review would, what changes would you like to see in that? Do you think that we should have in the legislation?
So the SES was originally established under an Act of Parliament, the State Counter Disaster Organisation Act of 1975. In 2003, that was consolidated into the Disaster Management Act by the state. How SES and Council has had their relationship is in the Disaster Management Act. There is Section 80 says that Council must have a response capability to disasters, which includes people and equipment and processes. Under the old Act, that was immediately followed by a section regarding the SES, and it was inferred but not clear that councils would meet that capability section by funding the SES.
Okay.
Also in that Act, there is a position called the local controller, which is council to, once again, I think this is an extremely positive thing, and there's only a number of councils in the state that do this. Council funds a person to be in that role. That person carries significant burden and responsibility, and there are some challenges, particularly where that's undertaken by a volunteer. And as I say, our council has decided that burden is probably one as such that shouldn't be carried by a volunteer, particularly when we're investing so much and we want to care for our assets and our people. In the PAXAR review that was conducted in circa 2013-14, there was the creation of Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, which combined what was Emergency Management Queensland, Queensland Fire and Rescue Service into a new entity. At that point, they amended the Disaster Management Act to remove the SES from the Disaster Management Act in complete components and insert it into the Fire and Emergency Services Act. So what we lost there was that nexus between the Section 80, which was the response capability, and then following along into funding the SES. So the clarity that we have tried to obtain and I suppose advocate for is clarity on council's roles and responsibilities through legislative amendments to SES, but also to recognise the significant burden that is placed potentially upon a volunteer in terms of responsibilities as the SES local controller, and whether that is the best option or should that sit with QFES or council or similar.
Noting the important work that the SES do, I guess I'm looking at who is actually ultimately responsible for them. Is it state or local government? And
therein lies the problem itself, is that that's not explicitly clear.
Right.
It assigns most of the responsibility to an SES local controller in the Act, which is the volunteer in most cases. In our case, obviously, council has an arrangement where we fund somebody to take on that role and that responsibility, but they are ultimately responsible.
Okay.
And that's something we want to seek through that legislative change, is to develop clear clarity around who is responsible, who owns the liability, who owns the risks.
So how do local and state governments ensure that the SES are properly resourced and trained and to do all the work for the disasters that we do get in Queensland?
Yeah, look, we are probably one of the most innovative councils in that space. So I previously fulfilled the role of SES Local Controller, so that was how I commenced at council in that position. And we have undertaken a process where, as an SES unit, we build a annual business plan and charter that tries to forecast what our requirements are into the future and how we can best strive towards that. We also assist SES to build some KPIs for themselves, and a lot of that is around, say, community engagement and building resilience in the community, so encouraging the community to take responsibility for its own preparedness and own response, thereby alleviating the burden on SES volunteers themselves. Obviously, we recognise that the most vulnerable people in our community can't always help themselves, and that's why the SES exists. But when we have cases of SES volunteers turning up to facilities and houses whilst a group of grown men and tradies are sitting around having a drink, and there's a 60-year-old climbing on a ladder to tarp their roof, is that necessarily fair on those volunteers when we've got more vulnerable people that could require assistance? That's not saying that those gentlemen may have had circumstances that we don't know about, but that's just the type of example.
How do we try to secure more money from the state government to help all the Ipswich City SES units?
Yeah, so we have been the beneficiary of that funding in relation to the amenities building, which has been fantastic. The SES runs a non-recurrent subsidy or grant program that we apply for pretty much every year.
Yep.
However, that funding, I previously in my SES role sat on the committee to allocate that funding. That funding is very limited, and when you are sitting there determining between some SES groups that don't have a toilet and they need to drive down the road to access toilet facilities versus us who might be seeking things for an upgrade of a facility or an additional vehicle, it's very hard to justify in that sense. So what we tend to find is there's a bucket of money that's probably not quite big enough for us to apply for at an officer and SES unit level, and then we've got a need that's about this big. So I suppose in a council officer point of view, we advocate as much as we can for funding and try to obtain funding for our Ipswich City SES unit volunteers. But that's a limited pool. Whether there's potentially some engagement or advocacy piece at a mayoral and council level that could look for clarity around the roles and responsibilities of SES and increasing those funding opportunities, then that would be something that's at the discretion of council.
And Mr. Pinner, you recently gave us all a briefing of La Nina, where the wet season's coming. The wet's coming. It looks like. In your role and also in your background, do you believe the SES units in Ipswich City have the resources and the training to support the community?
I would say that the Ipswich City SES unit has significant amounts of resources and support from Ipswich City Council to fulfil their jobs. I would suggest that they are probably in the top 10 of Queensland in resources and support, and the quality of their facilities, their vehicles, and how they are clean, tidy, safe and modern. So from a resourcing point of view, quite well, I would suggest they are well placed.
Are we over-resourcing it and the money could be spent elsewhere? I guess but that's probably a discussion. I might ask that question.
I'm happy to. We have done significant amounts of work over the years to streamline that and take advantage of what the state government does offer, and we have, compared to previous years, looked for efficiencies and made efficiencies and better utilised funding. So I'd suggest that we're at a pretty good maintainable level at the moment, but obviously that would be for the councillors through a budgetary type discussion, but efficiencies is something that we did actively strive towards and achieve in that space.
Thank you, Mr. Minner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Binder. I must say your explanation is very professional and has been very enlightening for the committee and for the general public that may be listening. So on behalf of the committee, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mayor, Council.
To proceed, I'll ask with respect to the recommendations in two parts. A, that the policy titled State Emergency Service Support Policy as detailed in attachment 1 be adopted, and for recommendation B, that Council continue to advocate for legislative review and clarity as to the State Emergency Service. I ask for a mover.
I'll move.
Councillor Kunzelman, a seconder. Mayor Harding. I'll open it for discussion.
This is someone else, just a discussion, just want to highlight the importance and the appreciation I think the people of Ipswich have for our SES, local SES units across Ipswich. You know, we are a city that has had floods and bushfires, and just really appreciative of that. It's good to see that they are well resourced for the coming La Nina wets that are coming up. But I'll also put my other, you know, looking after the purse strings of council, just make sure that we do get that balance right, that we do have a lot of areas of our community that are in need, and we need to be really cognizant of our fiduciary responsibilities to make sure that we're spending up the money as best as possible for the entire city.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mayor. I'll just add to that the State Emergency Services, like most other emergency services that we have in a well-organised society, it's something that only comes to mind when you need it. In the balance of times, they're preparing and training and undergoing the tasks they need to do to be able to activate. So Council does thank all their volunteers for their fine work. Any further discussion? In that fact, I'll put the motion. Those for? And it's unanimous. Move to item 2 on the agenda, Franklin Vale Creek Catchment Initiative, partnering agreement with Griffith University Australian River Institute. Does any committee member like a respective council officer to come forward to answer any questions? Yes?
Good morning, Mayor and Councillor. Philip Smith here, Natural Environment and Land Manager in the Infrastructure and Environment Department.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Recently, the council officers did a really great report on rivers, on the entire area here. Was the Franklin Vale Creek Catchment, this initiative, was that part of that report?
It was certainly part of the attached waterway health strategy, and it would have been considered in that report in terms of its impacts as a tributary to the Bremer River. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I thank you also for recommendation C with putting the cost up front for council officers, for us. Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you.
To proceed, I'll ask for a mover of the recommendations. There are 3 in total, quite lengthy, so I won't read them out. Mayor Harding. Seconder.
Yeah.
Councillor Kunzelman.
Sorry.
Thank you. I'll open it for discussion. If there's no further discussion, I'll put the motion. Those for? And it's unanimous. Thank you. That concludes the agenda items. With that respect, I'll call the meeting closed. Thank you.